Welcome to Advocacy 101, Leveraging Your Voice and Getting to Yes, hosted by Jennifer Witten. Jennifer is the Director of Governmental Policy and Advocacy for the Maryland Hospital Association. In that capacity, she serves as the Chief Advocate for Maryland's hospitals before state and federal legislatures and agencies. Jennifer graduated from National American University in Albuquerque in 2004 with a Bachelor of Applied Management. She is also a licensed practical nurse, has earned a bachelor's in business and master's in business management and healthcare management. Prior to becoming involved in helping to shape healthcare policy, Jennifer served 13 years as an EMT for New Mexico's Presbyterian healthcare system. Jennifer will share more about her journey from hands-on care to helping shape healthcare policy in her presentation. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tammy. I'm thrilled for this opportunity and appreciate, given kind of where we are nationally, the opportunity to emphasize the importance of advocacy. And I think on the first slide, the quote by Benjamin Franklin says it all. It's really, when we think about advocacy, it's really appealing to the interest of those who make decisions for us rather than the intellect, right? Not always the facts or data make that compelling story. So we're going to talk a little bit about advocacy basics and how you can become an advocate as a student, as an active member in your community. So today what we'd like to do for takeaways, really just want to cover some main topics. So we'd like to talk about the basics of advocacy versus what it means to lobby, why being engaged matters. So again, that the emphasis on being engaged in your community, civil engagement, whether that's committing to an issue that you see needs solutions to, or voting and what that means. Want to introduce a really powerful tool, i.e. in the title, Power Prism tool, how that can be helpful, not only for someone who does this for a profession, but really for anyone who has an issue that you're looking for a resolution to. Want to talk a little bit about the pathway of influence. So who can really help you get what you need? What does it mean to have an advocacy career? I am a registered lobbyist, but I didn't start out that way. So the transition of being a healthcare provider, how that led me into advocacy work, and then ultimately led me into lobbying work, and sort of that pathway. And also, again, just to remind folks, you don't have to be a lobbyist to really be an advocate and to affect change. And so emphasizing that today during our time together. And again, Tammy, as you indicated, we'll welcome questions as we work through this presentation. Really hope this is an exchange and a dialogue. So what is advocacy versus lobbying? Advocacy is really about engaging in an activity, whether you're an individual or a group, that is looking for change, looking for resolutions to issues, and looking at how the institutions in our society influence that. Advocacy is supporting or defending a cause or an issue. It's educating. So much of what advocacy is about is educating, whether that's using data, whether that's using stories. And advocacy can include, to some degree, lobbying. The difference between advocacy and lobbying is very focused on influencing decision makers to do something, an act, to persuade them to do something to the interest of typically an organization, right? And so the way we think about it is advocacy is educating and doing that outreach, and lobbying is asking for something specific for an elected member or decision maker to do to benefit your cause, your organization. So it's a very distinct kind of function, but in lobbying, you can engage in advocacy activities. So being an advocate, again, you know, I myself do this professionally, but got involved very early as a healthcare provider. And so I think when you think about being an advocate, you're really looking at driving solutions. So what is the change that you need to improve something, whether that's in your community, for your family, or if it's broader within a system, if you're working, say, within a nonprofit and there's an issue that you feel passionate about, what's the desired change you're looking for? Personal stories are powerful. I can't tell you enough how important it is for decision makers to hear a personal story and make that connection. As a lobbyist who represents an organization, I can come in with pages of data and facts and scientific review and so many resources that on paper would suggest that the elected officials should do something that I'm asking them to do. But it's really those personal stories and it's the connection that really move an issue forward. And so having advocates that are brave and engaged, that can share their personal stories, it's much more powerful than any data point you can put in front of a decision maker. As we move into primary season, many states are active in their primaries and also looking at local issues. So want to just emphasize, voting does matter. It's our democratic right to be engaged and to decide who we want to represent us. So regardless of your political affiliation, making sure that you are engaged in that process of elections is really important. So encourage everyone who's listening to this to go out and vote. Also think about fundraising and contributions. So as decision makers and those who have influence are engaging in their campaign, you as a constituent may be asked to contribute. So think about, how you want to use your resources. Think about those that you want to advocate with and how that in itself has a lot of leverage in terms of having that power base of using your dollars to support campaigns. And then lastly, just reminding, so much of advocacy is about relationships. And so I always encourage anyone who is taking up an issue is that you start a relationship by educating a member, a decision maker about the issue, but it's really that long-term engagement. So remembering that it's not just a one meeting, but you need to be engaged and build those relationships, throughout a long period of time. And not only with the decision maker, but also those that are close to them.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
I have a quick question on this because the distinction between being an advocate and a lobbyist was really interesting. And advocates who do have those very personal and compelling stories really, when is a good time for an advocate with a compelling story to know that they must pivot to lobbying and make that ask? It could be because relationship building is critical, educating is critical, but at some point, if you've got an issue that really matters to you, you have to have the ask.
Right. So that's a good question, Tammy. What I would say is, and we're going to talk a little bit about using the Power Prism and pathways of influence, but if the issue is a big issue or a broad issue, one of the things that I recommend is that folks align themselves. So whether it's with other community members that are having similar issues, whether there's an advocacy group that's sort of organized around your issues, or you are engaged with a coalition that is taking up your issue. I think, having those allies is always helpful. Right. But really, when you're moving from a place of telling your story in the advocacy is when you're making a request of a legislator. And so it's not always, I would say probably most advocates that go in with elected officials don't necessarily always have maybe the specific solution, but are asking for and desiring change or consideration for this important issue. Right. And when an advocate will say, we want you to take in consideration and support, these proposals, that's still within the advocacy, I think, perspective. But as a lobbyist, someone who is registered as and is paid, so that's also, I think, another important distinction. As an advocate, you may be representing a group, yourself, your community, and organization, but you're not getting paid for those activities. A lobbyist is getting paid for those activities. And so that's another distinction, is that they're going to be making a very specific request, such as, we want you to introduce this bill and pass this bill, or, you know, oppose a certain bill. So it's that slight distinction.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Let me get you.
So I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about the Power Prism. And the Power Prism, many of us that work kind of in advocacy broadly and engage in advocacy activities throughout the year, you know, find different tools that we find to be successful in terms of getting decision makers to do what we would like them to do based on our issues. And so I do think that this could apply to anyone who's thinking about taking up advocacy and thinking about issues. Even if it's an individual, it's still, there's very good concepts here. I will say that M&T Strategy Consulting developed this tool, so there's many more resources on their website, and I have worked with them in years past, but wanted to go through some of the key aspects of that. So the Power Prism is really, how do you get decision makers to do what you would like them to do? And so the first piece of that is developing a campaign. Now, as an advocate, you may not develop a campaign, but the core piece of that is what is the issue that is you're looking for a solution, issue identification. I think if you can be specific about what issues are, that is helpful for decision makers, because if you come in with big, broad issues, for instance, I'll throw one that's kind of controversial, gun control. That is a broad concern, but if there's something specific about your community or population you represent that connects to that issue, I think the more specific you can be, it's helpful for that decision maker. I think data and facts do help tell your story, so I'd always say personal stories are most convincing, but there are other tools that you may want to use that can help illustrate some of the points that you're making, and so having some of that collateral available to you is always helpful. Building a coalition, and so that really means who else cares about this issue? Who else are your allies that you can align yourself with to work with your decision makers to address this issue? Again, a note on fundraising and campaign contributions. When I say this, I say that decision makers are usually influenced by two things. Typically, it's the votes that they can get, and it's the funding that they can get for re-election, right? And so being smart about the power that you have as an advocate and using that. And so any resources you have financially that you may use if you do contribute to decision makers, elected officials, you know, think about that, be smart about where those dollars go. Grassroots relationships and advocates, again, building relationships is key to any advocacy work you do, because you may have someone who doesn't necessarily agree with your issue, but if you're a trusted person or you build that relationship with them, they're more inclined to continue that conversation with you and work with you. Media advocacy, so any social pressure. So if there's an issue that there's given some attention, or there's other mechanisms of getting to the decision maker outside of a one-on-one conversation, use that to your advantage. And so having a sense of what's going on in the media, having a sense of if, you know, this person might be responsive, say, to social media, what tools do they use, that's always helpful. And then most important, the elevator pitch, what is your message? And so when you are advocating and you're reaching out to decision makers and elected officials, what is your key message? And being very specific about what the issue is. I think, again, the more specified you can get, the easier it is for them to take that into consideration and take some action on that issue. So we'll move a little bit now to pathways of influence. And so this is really focused on, you know, identifying who can give you what you want. So again, these are elected officials typically that are those that you're trying to influence, and that can be at the local level. That might be city council, it might be the mayor's office, it could be state, it could be your legislators or your governor, and it could be, you know, your congressional members. And so that's really important in figuring out who it is that you need to target your efforts. Know, once you've identified who that person is, understand how you can use pressure in different points to use to leverage your power when you're trying to get them to address your issues. Know, again, who those decision makers are, so kind of doing your due diligence to figure out, is this a local issue that needs to be solved? Is there a city ordinance that needs to be addressed? Is this with my school board of education, for instance? Or is this a broader issue that's really at the federal level? So knowing what pathway you need to follow. Again, understanding what makes a decision maker tick. Really, it comes down to some basic principles. Typically, it's whether or not there's funding attached, is there fundraising for them on campaign re-elections. They're going to be moved by votes, so they're going to be very specific about what are their constituent needs. That's going to be top of their mind. And also, again, a personal connection to the issue. I highly encourage any advocate at any level to know what your connections are and don't underestimate them. I think we have relationships in the community, and so I'll talk a little bit in a minute about decision makers and identifying those opportunities. But you may be engaged in your community, whether that's through going through a faith organization, it might be through the PTO, there might be mutual friends, there might be professional connections. And so really thinking about the connections that you may have to this person and being able to leverage that. And again, emphasizing the process, knowing where you need to focus your efforts so that you don't feel like it's not obtainable to be an advocate and who you should reach out to. And so thinking through, where your issue can be solved will be critical when you think about outreach and advocacy. So let's spend just a few minutes to talk about decision maker advocacy. And when I say decision maker, typically these are elected officials, not always. Sometimes they're appointed individuals, but typically we're talking about elected officials. So a few things to always think about when you think about your power of influence with them. And this is always helpful to do a little homework before you do any outreach to them or their staff. So always know, what's their current position, where do they want to go? So, you might have a city council member who really would like to eventually be a delegate or a senator in the state, or maybe you've got somebody who's in the Board of Education that's looking at, running for a state or a federal position. And so understanding sort of their ambition and where they're going. Have they ever talked about your issue? Do they have any sense of awareness of your issue? Have they said anything to the media? Are there any other statements that they've identified your issue in prior experiences? I think if a member has that experience with an issue, it's a little easier for them to get an understanding of why you're advocating and what needs to happen. Can't overemphasize the influence of media and social media presence. Now with social media and so many tools, we can engage with elected officials and their staff at real-time moments. And so using that to your advantage and bringing that awareness. And so thinking through how you may use that. What motivates them? And so for each, it's going to be different. Some may be more motivated by ambition and opportunities to serve. Some may be motivated by, their professional experience. Some may be motivated by their community, their family, their personal experience. So kind of understanding them as a person and what motivates them. Understanding the constituents that they represent, understanding the area that they represent, and the opportunities there, I think is always very helpful. Understanding who supports them financially. So any organization that supports a candidate, in most states have to file that, and so you can get a sense by which organizations have some influence over decision makers, and that might give you an insight to what sways a decision maker. Where do they get their news and information? Some, continue to want the newspaper and are very local about the news and where they get their information, and some will be driven more by social media. So having that information is really helpful. And again, do they have a personal connection to the issue that you're advocating on? Because that personal connection can make it very human for them and make it very personal, and likely will lead them to be more active on the issue.
Jennifer, one thought on figuring out what makes your decision maker tick is to look too at the committees they serve on, or the subcommittees that will speak to what interests them or what matters to their constituents, or both.
Absolutely, and thank you, Tammy, for that. And so when you think about sort of the process to get to a solution of the issue you may be advocating, it's always important to know how that member serves. And so to that point, if they serve on a committee that may have jurisdiction over the issue that is important to you, that's going to be very, very beneficial. In the end of the day, you have to identify really who has the power to give you what you want. And so if this person is a chair of committee, they likely have that leadership ability to move an issue forward. If they're not a chair of a committee, how can they influence the leadership and their colleagues to move an issue forward, regardless if it's a local or state or federal issue? I think it's a very similar structure. And so how can they align themselves with leadership? So I think that that's an important point, and that understanding that structure for that. And there's a lot of references on, different committees in each state, and probably each, local jurisdiction might have a slightly different structure. But in the end, who has the ability to give you what you want? Who's got that ability to pass an initiative that's important to you? So absolutely, that's key. Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so I've provided a slide here. We'll move to connecting with elected officials. And so I've provided a slide here. I just want to overemphasize, you should know as an advocate, which district do you live in? Understand who your city council members are. Understand who your state representatives are, and obviously your congressional members. Understanding which committees they sit on, and if they've got a leadership role is very important. Understand if they've been involved in these issues through their committee assignments, have they've taken this issue up. And I also want to just emphasize, I don't think we give enough emphasis on really working with staff. And so my experience, both as an advocate and as a lobbyist, is that staff are critical. They really are the ones who get to know these issues. They're the ones that do the research. They're the front line for constituents. And so I always recommend that any advocate don't ever be disappointed if you have a meeting with an elected official and there's a conflict and you have to meet with staff, because they will influence that elected official and their decision process. And so it's just as important to build that relationship with a staff member. And that goes, that's an ongoing process. So I just really emphasize the importance of staff there. And then provided just a couple of resources so that as individuals are thinking about advocating and thinking about who represents me and how do I move an issue forward, provided a couple of resources here where you can start doing that investigation, identify, who your elected representatives are. Many states have a state resource as well, and obviously, depending if it's a local issue, your city council or your mayor's office will have those resources for you as well. So next, want to spend just a couple of moments talking about careers in lobbying and advocating. There's, I think, some misperceptions about, lobbying, that you have to have a law degree or you had to have gone through the political science program, or that's kind of what you wanted to do. And so I just thought I would spend just a minute talking about, my pathway into this is that I initially was a healthcare provider. And as I was working with more and more patients, I had identified that there was just really fragmentation in our healthcare system, and that patients really needed an advocate. And so that got me very interested in policy and looking at kind of the healthcare system and how we can improve that healthcare system. That really led me to pursue more business at that point, and looking at policy broadly. by doing that work, I was exposed to many more opportunities. I started to advocate both on a local level and a state level on key issues that I thought were important. So for example, my grandfather had a stroke. And in the state that I was living in New Mexico, there were only a couple of hospitals that were actually designated stroke centers. So there was a huge gap of specialists and hospitals that could respond to patients who had strokes. And I became aware of this through my personal experience and my policy experience. So I was then asked to come to the state capitol to talk about this, again, that personal connection, bringing in that policy perspective to advocate on the need to really improve the way we delivered stroke care in the state. That led me then to opportunities as a career to work with associations, which then eventually led me into doing direct lobbying work. So now I am a registered lobbyist, but I work on issues that I have experience and I have passion for. So that's another key piece, is that I think if you identify what you're passionate about and what matters to you, I think that that really helps, you know, drive that change. Again, much of the work that I do is about building relationships on a multitude of levels, not only with decision makers and elected officials, staff, but also other stakeholders that are involved in the same issue and looking for solutions. And leveraging, again, your own experience and your own education. You don't have to go to law school to do lobbying work. Sometimes it's very helpful, but you don't have to have that experience. And then a little bit about just, you know, when you represent an organization, you're representing the organization's kind of overall needs, identifying opportunities for the organization, say, versus working for a number of clients where you might have a multitude of, you know, different initiatives going on. And so there's a little distinction there. But all of those opportunities have served me well professionally and personally. So I think, Tammy, that kind of concludes the main points that I wanted to talk to everyone and just share my thoughts again about advocacy generally. Appreciate this opportunity, appreciate really the foundation that National American gave me in terms of opening the door and thinking about business and thinking about healthcare, but how to take my experience, which led me into some really great opportunities professionally and personally to further expand, you know, my work in advocacy to doing lobbying. So it really has been sort of, it was a foundation of my professional development. So want to thank the university for that. So Tammy, I will pause now and turn it back to you and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm glad you closed on your personal story, because had you not, I was going to ask you about that journey from New Mexico to the nation's capital and all your steps in between. So I appreciate that you shared. I've opened up Razan's line. Do you have any questions, Razan? And while he's thinking, and he may not, I just wanted to, I had shared with you, Jennifer, that in a former life I did lots of advocating and organized advocates, and although I was never a registered lobbyist, I did my share of lobbying, and I really, like you, the importance of meeting with staff and building relationships with staff really can't be overstated. Those are the folks that know the issues far better than the elected official, at least in the process of collecting information and helping that elected official make a decision. So I appreciated hearing you say that.
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree. From my experience, both as an advocate and as somebody who does this professionally, you know, many of the staffers come with their own experience and background in education, and they really do influence the decision maker in terms of what they will take up and what decisions they make. So that's just a really important aspect to not, as you say, don't underestimate the staff's role in the process.
And they're very accessible. I mean, there's some that you can pick up the phone and often have the conversation you need right away versus waiting on the calendar to open up for the members. So, and I'll also add too, you had, I think in your presentation, you also emphasized the importance of face-to-face meetings when you can have those. And there are, you know, every member of Congress has a local office. So right in your hometown, it is possible to meet with the member and or staff.
Yep, absolutely. So I understand, you know, that takes time, and it's hard given all the demands we have on our schedules. But I think for most elected officials, whether it's a congressional member or you know, a state representative, they do want to make themselves available. So they do have in-district offices, and again, staff are very accessible. They try to, you know, take time throughout the year to make themselves available. And so encourage anyone who wants to advocate on behalf of an issue to have that, you know, schedule those meetings, get time with that member. And even if it's that you've identified an issue, but you don't quite yet have the solution, start those conversations, do that outreach, and build that relationship.
Yeah, excellent point. I'm sending my email to Razan right now. He was just interested in having a copy of your presentation. I will post the presentation with the video on YouTube, and I'll also link it on our website, so it's available to others who missed today's webinar.
Great.
Jennifer, I don't have any other questions. I'm really, really grateful for your time today and your expertise. You really shared a wealth of information on how being an advocate is really accessible for just anyone who has a passion about an issue. So I appreciate that.
Yes, Tammy, and thank you for the opportunity. And I can make myself available for any additional questions. I think my presentation has my email. Please, folks, you know, reach out to me with any questions. But again, encourage anyone, whether you do it as a personal drive or something that you want to take up, say, you know, through a more organized path. I just encourage folks to think about being an advocate on issues that are important to you, and using the ability to leverage your voice and your votes to make that difference.
Terrific. Thank you so much for your time today, Jennifer.
You're welcome. Thank you.